Okay, guys, welcome back to Sex and Gender. Let's continue where we left off last time. Let's bring up my Files tab in Google Chrome. So we were talking about power. As we're talking about sex, sexuality, gender, etc., an important issue to discuss is power. So when we have boxes that we identify with, straight white male, bisexual Latina female, agendered African American, right? That those boxes then give us a structure by which to understand ourselves and relate to others, as well as a shared identity with other people, and with that becomes power, that we can demand that other people acknowledge or conform to us, and we can then do so with cooperation with other people. It doesn't always work that way, as you know. So one of the things we highlighted last time is that some gender or sexual identities are less powerful than others. What is the homicide rate amongst transgendered African Americans? If you're curious, you can look it up, but let me assure you it's very, very high. The rates of rape, assault, etc., homicide are quite high amongst trans African Americans. And so that's a very important thing, or very important fact for us to wrap our heads and hearts around, that there are some identities that are oppressed, that there's very little power that comes associated with those identities, and therefore people with these identities or who are given these identities are often victimized. So at the same time, though, it's important for us to acknowledge the lack of power and the way in which when people come together, there can be more power than there was otherwise. I was thinking of a case that happened in the Bronx 2 years ago where a woman was being sexually assaulted, and there were some African American transgendered prostitutes standing on a street corner. And as that woman was suffering an assault, these transgendered women came over and confronted the attacker and protected the woman who was being assaulted. And together with the shared identity is powerful, even amongst highly and severely oppressed people like transgendered African American women. So we can begin to see that identities still have power. And if you remember, power is the ability to influence or cause change in the world in social relationships. So having no space and being in an ambiguous space in terms of race, gender, etc., then can really cause hiccups in terms of our ability to affect change in the world. Instead, power seems to be oriented at us rather than us being able to orient power the other way. And one of the reasons why we have this class, guys, is because of incidents like what happened this week. And not only it happened in one of the clinics where I consult. So I learned about this too late to intervene, unfortunately. I learned that the clinical staff at one of the treatment centers that I consult with, it's part of the overall, at night, I'm the clinical director. By day, I'm a full-time professor, but at night, I'm a clinical director. And I learned that in another one of our buildings, there was an agendered person, somebody who identifies as agendered. They have a particular name on their intake paperwork given by the insurance company, and they have asked, please, he, she does not fit me. Would you please they, them pronouns, and would you please call me by this particular name? And it's a different name than the one on the insurance form. And the staff universally said no. And not only did they say no to this particular agendered person, but they made it a point of mockery in the clinical team meeting. Now, keep in mind, these are therapists, and I would argue these are therapists who should know better. And so they made it a point of mockery in the clinical team meeting that how silly it is that this person wanted to be called by a different name than the name their parents gave them, and how uncomfortable it is for the clinical staff to think of somebody as agendered and to treat somebody in an agendered fashion, despite or in face of their very kind request to be treated with respect. And so it was really heartbreaking for me to find out that a client had made a very respectful request. Please use they them pronouns when referring to me, and please would you call me by this other name than the name on the roster. And the clinical team's response was no, and basically derided this person for being foolish or mentally ill for making this particular request. Now, this is an addictions rehab center, and the reason why this is heartbreaking is issues around gendered and gendered identity, and more importantly, people's responses to gender identity is something that fuels this particular person, this particular client's addiction. Their addiction is very much wrapped up in the way in which they are placeless in the world, and that they are looking for a way to have some power and some influence, some security, some respect. And the clinical team is now part of the problem. So therefore, they are now a part of the addiction cycle. Rather than preventing it, or rather than healing it or ameliorating it, they are now part of it. And as I said, unfortunately, I learned too late. So there was nothing I could do for that particular client at the time, but I now can work and have been working with the staff and asking a very simple question. What is it about this client's basic request? Please refer to me as they, them pronoun, and please refer to me by this name, not the name on the insurance roster, but this other name. Why is that a problem for you as a clinician? Why is that a problem for you as a person? How is it that you not understanding the box that they are identifying with causes you to refuse to respect the box that they are asking to be put in? Okay. Now, as this course goes through, we will increasingly see the benefits and limitations of boxes, right? That if I have a particularly secure identity and I insist on being treated by that identity, then that's well and good. At the same time, the very box may constrain me in the various ways that it simultaneously liberates me. But that's not what these clinical staff were thinking. They were just, well, I don't know, it's just weird. I don't know. Like, and they insist on calling this person by the gender that they put the gender box in. She's asking students, she's obviously a woman. Like, why is it a gendered thing? Like, she's a woman. Like, why doesn't she just accept the fact that she's a woman and what that means? Right? Oh my gosh. And so then the same exercise I had you guys do this last class period, I had them do. Pull out a piece of paper, write down all the boxes that you would check on a demographics form. Now write the percentage to which this fits you, right? And so with many of these therapists, they're like, yeah, you know, if they're female fits me about 70%. With the guys, it fits me about 70%. I said, well, imagine it feels like 20%, right? That if someone comes up and says, hey, you're a woman, there's a tiny bit of overlap with the box they're forcing on you and how you actually feel to be. I said, that's going to put you in a really confusing place because people will keep assuming that that box fits you 100% and interacting and acting towards you like the box woman fits you 100% when it doesn't. And they keep treating you according to that, right? They're going to be unintentionally hurting you a lot based on their assumptions of you. You know, like I joked last time and shared with you, sports ball bores me to tears. I'm not interested in sports ball. It's a simulacrum for combat, right? The contest of wills. Why? Let's just give these people swords and knives and let them hack at each other, right? That'd be far more interesting than moving a ball down a field to put it in a place for points. Yay, points, right? That bores me to tears. And so imagine a world where 9 out of 10 things people assume about me don't fit me. That's what it's like for some people to be agendered. That when people hit you with the assumption, oh, let's go shopping for makeup and dresses. This person's not interested in makeup and dresses, right? So, again, the reason why I wanted to share that example is it just happened. And you notice it's all about power. That the comfort and security of those giving the boxes, the clinical staff, was more important to the clinical staff than the well-being of the person whose boxes they were not familiar with and who asked for a very small concession in terms of language, right? They didn't ask for large concessions, just please use they, them pronouns, and would you please call me by this name? And they wouldn't do it. Now they will now. but I had to intervene, and I'm sorry I had to. These are therapists. They should know better. So, what about the power provided by ambiguous gender spaces? It's vulnerable, right? And some people say, Matt, you just told a story of how this person has no power at all. Yes, and simultaneously, if you were paying attention, I also told you a story how this person has a great deal of power because of those that are allied with them, and that's me. Okay? The people in these ambiguous gendered spaces may get more power because you are their ally, that you will not tolerate them being bullied or disrespected or assaulted, that you become an extension of their power. Okay? So that's one of the reasons we talk about this. So let's talk about negotiating identities. So last time we evoked the construct called social construction. So social construction, there's gender, sexuality, identity, etc. All of these are arising through and constituted by language and culture. So, as we talked about last time, as language and culture are both fluid, so too are our social constructions. So, we actively participate and use the generation of language. That means we also participate in what something means, like gender and sexuality. Now, in our next unit, we're going to deconstruct what sex means and what gender means. And we're going to talk about how they overlap and are different at the same time. So think of social constructions of gender as our shared cultural meanings about what sex means. But sex are the biological facts, the chromosomal facts of somebody's biology. And gender and sex align in certain ways and don't in other ways. There's a lot of things that we assume about sexes and the similarities and differences between the sexes that don't actually empirically exist. They're just social constructions, or they're importantly social constructions, depending on how you want to look at it. So, how did the social construction of straight, gay, male, female, how did that become political? So, identity politics, just reading from the slide here, please read along with me. Identity politics is the notion that our identities of ourselves conflate with a particular shared identity with others, which are boundaries to protect, to be protected and defended, lest me and this group, by extension, lose power. Okay? So, many of you have seen this. Any attack against my group or anything that I perceive to be an attack against this group is an attack against me personally. So this is something that I've confronted. So UVU is the fifth institution I've been a professor for, and this is the only place I've worked where this following dynamic happens. That if I'm highlighting, for example, a controversy within, let's say, the LDS Church, for example, or the Catholic Church, or whatever denomination, publishes a position vis-a-vis gender or sexuality, and I bring it up in this class, that rather than people hearing, okay, here's the position that this particular church is talking about, and here's the ways in which it makes sense to them, and the ways in which people from a different point of view would criticize it. Or maybe even people within the same point of view will criticize it. Some of the most people who are most vocally concerned with, let's say, a position within the LDS Church, for example, are members of the LDS faith. They're like, we're not really comfortable with that particular position our church took. What's interesting to me, though, is that by pointing that out, some people then feel personally attacked. So the LDS Church comes out with a policy that says if there is a child and that child has a gay parent, then it changes when and how that child can be baptized, when and how, if it's a male child, later they can receive the priesthood, etc. It changes that. And there are people who have a lot of heartburn and heartbreak about that. And rather than us saying, okay, where's the heartburn and heartbreak coming back? Some people just rush to the defense and say, no, you're attacking me. If you criticize my faith, you're attacking me personally. No, nobody's attacking you personally. Why can't we talk about this? Even if we disagree, it's not about you personally, right? That shows that somebody has bought whole cloth into identity politics. Like the other day, for example, I am blessed with many colorful relatives, right? Drapers are not a boring group of people. Our family reunions are twice a year and they are epic. And they're big people with very strong opinions and largely conservative, but not always. Well, one of my cousins is a flag waving. Uh, if it's a Republican president, that Republican president can do no wrong, and was very vocal about that. And so I was highlighting some of my concerns with the current Republican president, and it was an immediate war. It was immediate butthurtness on his part. It was immediate, why do you always attack me? Why are you always tearing me down? Then he had to attack me. Well, you must be some kind of commie liberal. You must, right? The ad hominem attacks, etc. immediately. And I looked at him and said, actually, I wasn't talking about you at all. I was showing some concern with some policy decisions of a particular political leader, and you're fired up like I've stabbed you in the spleen. I didn't stab you in the spleen. Why are you angry and yelling at me, right? And so we can do that with politics, right? That identity politics become very much politics. And so likewise, I've seen neurotic defenses and LGB identity, the pink triangle warriors. One day, for example, there were some some activists who were protesting in downtown Salt Lake. This has been several years ago, and they were wearing black shirts with pink triangles in it. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the organization. I'm rather chagrined. And they were protesting some of the policy positions of the LDS Church. And some of the things, they had placards, etc., which were pronouncing certain things, and some of them were accurate and well worth having heartache and consideration over, and others were misquotes and taken out of context. And so I'm there and I'm chatting with them and empathizing, et cetera. And I point out that, hey, actually some of what you're doing is a misquote, and you'll lose some credibility in your position. So here's the actual quote, or here's what it is in context, and that might help. And next thing you know, I'm a homophobe, I'm a bad guy, and they're galvanizing against me, et cetera, where we were friends just a minute ago. And so there was that, by criticizing us taking a quote out of context, you're now attacking me personally, is where it started with the person I was pointing out. Hey, your quote's actually out of context and actually means this other thing, which is actually for your position, not against it. So you might want to take that placard down. You know what I mean? So the political has become personal, and the personal has become political. So, like, some of you have seen this on social media. Any positive statement or support of another group, which can be seen as in opposition to mine, is an attack against me personally. So, social media account like Instagram and Facebook and Tumblr and Twitter, etc., I very rarely use them. Like, hey Draper, you're so colorful and have these weird points of view. I'd love to follow you on Twitter. Great, you'll never see me tweet anything, because I learned early on that if I made a statement in any social media that seemed pro-life, then there would be a flame war immediately. If I made a statement that sounded to other people to be pro-choice, there would be a flame war. If I made a post or made a tweet about something about pro-LGBT marriage, flame war. Anti-LGBT marriage, flame war. And what's interesting is very few people understood in context where I was coming from, but it was immediate. Oh, well, if you are okay with gay marriage, then you yourself must be gay. Or if you're okay with gay marriage, then you must hate families. Or what? No. Where is this coming from? And yes, I know I've studied social constructionism for many years. I've studied identity politics for many years, and I get where it comes from. It just disheartens me that some of the people who flame the loudest are the most educated, but unfortunately, not necessarily the wisest. So we have lost the power of civil discourse in our society, and it breaks my heart. One of the secret agendas of this class, one of the many secret agendas of this class, is for those of us who are a part of this to be part of civil discourse. You and I don't have to agree on things, but understand I already respect you. Okay? I will listen to you and I will hear you out. And you may be able to change my mind on some things, and I'd like to hope I can change yours. But to do so, we need to respect one another and to be open to one another. So This is a colleague of mine. She teaches at another institution. She says, I say this in my classes. The problem isn't men, it's patriarchy. The problem isn't white people, it's white supremacy. The problem isn't straight people, it's homophobia. Recognize systems of oppression before letting individual defensiveness paralyze you from dismantling them. Yeah, like, it's been interesting to me watching. I was in a university meeting. Guys, this just happened. So I was in a university meeting with very bright, very capable colleagues of mine here. And a colleague asked about the Black Lives Matter movement on campus. And then one of my colleagues said, well, but all lives matter. And she kept sticking to that point that all lives matter. Yes, of course they do. But can we stick to the point? What about the Black Lives Matter movement? If you want to start a Caucasian Lives Matter or a Gay Lives Matter or a Straight Lives Matter, please do that. But right now we're talking about Black Lives Matter. And she says, why can't we talk about the fact that all lives matter? And I said, well, of course they do. But this is like you coming to a funeral of a child and announcing to the grieving people in the funeral, hey, all children's lives matter. And realize how you sound when you say that, right? So the problem isn't men, it's patriarchy. Some of you are saying, well, what do you mean by patriarchy? Patriarchy is the cultural assumption that men are in charge or that men are better or that men are the deciders, right? It isn't white people, it's white supremacy, right? White supremacy is this belief that white people are somehow superior. And it is as often assumed as explicitly believed. So the problem isn't straight people, it's homophobia, right? That there are people who are uncomfortable with being around, acknowledging, loving, caring for the gay people in their lives. Recognize systems of oppression before letting individual defensiveness paralyze you from dismantling them. Okay? That it is important for us to look at the way in which certain cultural practices and certain cultural styles are peeling away or preventing the empowerment of certain people based on certain identities. So, again, part of the goal of this course is for us to rethink identity politics. So, as I've said before, and you may get sick of hearing this because I'm going to repeat myself a lot, our socially constructed sex gender identities belie a far more complicated underlying experiences. These identity politics these identity politics create boxes that protect us with their boundaries, but simultaneously imprison us with their walls. So, for example, for me, I'm big old tattooed, well-educated white trash. At the same time, though, I'm very emotional, compassionate. I don't like sports ball. I'm not okay with competition. I'm not good at fixing or building things. I'm deeply romantic. I write poetry, for crying out loud. I love to snuggle, and yet I identify as a man. The identity politic boxes don't fit me 100%. Likewise, my wife, my sweetheart, is logical, analytical, raised on sports. Like, she is a huge fan of WWE. Right? It used to be WWF when we were younger, but World Wrestling. She likes competition. She's great at fixing and building, does not have a romantic bone in her body, loves to snuggle, so that's a nice compatibility, and yet identifies as a woman. In fact, it's really fun because my wife is now almost 50. She just turned 49, and she's trying to figure out how to flirt. It is so cute. Like, just this last weekend, we were on a long drive together, and she made this really awkward comment, and she looks at me and she goes, did you see that? I'm flirting with you, right? It was so fun. It was so endearing. And so there are a lot of ways in which the woman box fits her very well, but there are many ways in which it doesn't. And so think of the boxes as our stereotypes around sex and gender, right? So when I am around other men who fit the gender box in other ways than I do, then there's often a disconnect. Again, I've shared that they assume I like sports or assume that I'm unemotional, right? And therefore, when I demonstrate I don't like sports and I'm a deeply emotional person, then that creates discomfort in those social relationships for them. Okay. Likewise, there's something broken at my wife's school, and rather than calling janitorial to come fix it, she doesn't even think to do that. She just pulls out the tools and starts fixing it herself. That has created some tension at work because that's just not what women do, right? So likewise, in LGBT communities, one of the things that we've researched and we've found repeatedly is that those who are bisexual or transgendered often feel marginalized within LGBT meetings and within LGBT organizations. And so it was like some trans students were meeting with me last year, and they're like, well, we need to choose our alienation. We're either, a form of alienated within the broader heteronormative or heterosexist communities, but we're also alienated in other ways within the trans communities. Within LGB communities, because they can't figure out what box to put us in, and the heteronormative or gender binary people, the cisgendered people, can't figure out which box to put us in. So it's like we got to choose our alienation. So there's also the confusion of lesbian and gay people who live in heteronormative relationships and have children via heterosexual intercourse. So in my career, I have done marriage counseling when the couple is a heterosexual seeming couple, but one of them is gay, and they're able to function sexually, but they are married knowing that one of the partners can never be fulfilled in that particular marriage. So just a few years ago, I was counseling a couple where she is not sexually attracted to her husband and hasn't been. They have 3 kids. They knew going into the marriage, but they are deeply and dearly best friends. And so part of the couples counseling was trying to figure out for them how to continue to negotiate and navigate their sex life. And one of the questions that's on my table very much is, should they, right? Should they have to figure this out, and should they have to navigate it? But they had certain very strong moral commitments to one another, to their religion, to their families, etc., that they were willing to do this. And wow, okay. And it's not the first time I've been in that situation in the counseling world, and it probably won't be the last. But one of the things that happens is because she's an out of the box as a lesbian, then that has put her in difficulties with her church and some confusions. Well, you can't be a lesbian because you're with a man, right? And likewise, she doesn't receive any support within the LGBT communities because she can't be a lesbian because she's with a man. And so she is left without support or without comfort because her experience transcends and violates the stereotypical boxes that we put on one another, right? And so there are a lot of confusion and comforts and rejections and acceptances, all due to these stereotypified identity politic boxes we persist on forcing one another into. Imagine having to pay for support where she comes into me and she says, well, I'm a lesbian, but I'm married to a man and our sex life is difficult and challenging, but because of certain commitments that I've made, I am going to stick to this marriage. And I'm the one, and it's like she has to pay me to be the one to look at her and say, I get it. Well, if she'd met me on the street, I would have said, bro, I get it, man. I feel you. That is rough. What can I do to offer you some moral support, right? So here's my challenge for you. And this is going through the course, one of many challenges I'm going to offer. Many of us have bought uncritically into identity politics. So I posted a blog, and I've learned not to do this anymore. It just dealing with the fallout, dealing with the drama isn't worth it. I'd rather create a personal difference in my personal life than fight with trolls on the internet. So one is, I'm so triggered by what you're saying. So I wrote a post, and it was about trans lives matter, etc. And this person posts how triggered they are and how upset they are, started fielding attacks against me, my intellect, my character, etc. But I didn't say anything about this person personally. I don't even know this person personally. And in reading their response, it was clear they weren't understanding what I was saying. And so my response is, hey, look, I'm not talking about you personally. And this person's response is, yes, but this box, and they identified their racial and sexual gendered identity, gives me power and belonging. So it is about me. You've touched my box by writing your blog post. Therefore, by touching my box, you are touching me. Whoa. Okay. No, that's not the way it works. You can talk about problems with men, but that's not necessarily a problem with me as a man, right? And so, counter to the counter, yes, but the box that gives us power and belonging also takes power away in certain contexts and doesn't fit anyone perfectly. So, my criticism is not about you, but about our tendency to box other people and how these boxes constrain possibilities for compassion, connection, and understanding. Like I wrote a heartfelt post, and you're already hating me personally, even though you've never met me. You've made something personal that wasn't personal, right? When if we begin to understand this tendency to unbox one another, and how that can actually create boxes and barriers against compassion and connection, maybe I'm pointing that out. Maybe we could start punching holes in boxes so we can at least reach through and touch one another in a G-rated way or with consent as appropriate, right? Counter to the counter to the counter. This was the response. I'm so triggered, I'm going to complain to those in power. I'm going to contact the people at your university and have them take away your power, because it's much easier than for me to have to think about what you're saying and risking that there might be truthfulness in it, right? So I'm going to complain to your Title IX office. I'm going to see if I can get your job taken away, etc. Now, of course, that didn't go anywhere, because if you read the original post, it was very Title IX friendly. So the Title IX officer took one look at this and said, there's nothing I can do here. I don't even know what's going on. I'm spinning. I can't help anywhere. So please start thinking carefully about our stereotypes around sex, gender, sexuality, etc. Start looking at them as just stereotypes. Appreciate that everyone you encounter both embodies the stereotypes that our culture has, as well as violate them. And sometimes it's in obvious ways that they're violating them, and in some ways it's in subtle ways. So we're going to hit this point several times, to the point it may be a mantra. For those of you that have taken some of my other classes, like the psychology of good and evil, counseling and psychotherapy, etc., you're very familiar with these ideas. If you're going to take those courses later in your curriculum, you're going to hear this again. I think this is very important. This is a Draperism, this thinking dimensionally, thinking multidimensionally. So in this class, we apply it to sex, gender, sexuality. In other classes, we apply it to, again, good and evil, or counseling and psychotherapy, etc. What I've noticed is that there are very few fourth dimensional thinkers in the world, and I grieve that fact. So what do you mean by fourth dimensional thinking, Draper? Yeah, okay, good question. So let's start with the first dimension. The first dimension of thought is that it's unary thinking, right? Unidimensional thinking. This is this, meaning that this thing has certain definable characteristics that make it what it is. Think of first dimensional thinking as categorical thinking, okay? So first dimension, here's the definition of a thing. Does the thing I'm looking at meet the definitions? Well, if it does, then it's that thing, okay? So here, you'll notice this next slide. We get some more concrete examples. So the second dimension is if we have a certain construct, a certain definable construct, then as we have that particular definable construct, we're also defining its opposite. Okay. So if this is this, then this thing, other thing is that, and that is opposite of this. So any change to the definition of this, I'm simultaneously changing the definition of that in an equal and opposite way. Okay, not necessarily equal, in an opposite way. So hot is hot, and the opposite of hot is cold. Okay. So, and here's what makes something hot, and here's the definition of that. And therefore, anything that is the opposite of that is cold. Okay. So light and dark. So any change the definition of light, I'm simultaneously changing the definition of dark. So this is also known as oppositional thinking. This is also known as what I call binary thinking. Third dimension is this is relative to all the that's. So third dimension trinary thinking is also relativistic thinking. It's the observation that many phenomena do not exist in polar opposites. And if I can change any one thing, it might change the categorical definition of this. So it's all relative to your point of view, right? If I look at this thing from this point of view, it very much changes what it is, right? So look at the space between my fingers. Well, that space has just disappeared. Now it's still there, but now it's contextualized by my eye in the back of my hand, right? Or the palm of my hand. So this space changes depending on how I look at it. Okay, so that is third dimensional thinking, right? I can take that same space, look at it this way, or this way, and it keeps changing how that space appears. So it's all relative. It all depends on your point of view. Okay. Fourth dimensional thinking, this is what it is and simultaneously in relation to all of the that's. This is known as quaternary thinking, fourth dimensional thinking, or my favorite, contextual thinking. So what the space means depends on the context of the space, right? Sometimes this can be the space between a bullet killing me because it's punctured my heart and me barely surviving, right? But that same space can be the emotional distance between me and my lover that's never quite filled and therefore a constant ache in my soul. That same amount of space can mean something very different depending on the context of that particular space. And so contextual thinking is, I've noticed, the hardest form of thinking for many people. Not everybody, but for many people, to look at things contextually. If I've got a friend who is depressed, is happiness a good? Well, now that's binary thinking. If, well, they should be happy, right? Now I've just engaged in binary thinking. Or, depression's all relative. Man, it's just how he or she rolls, man. Okay. A fourth dimensional thinker, we go, okay, what is the context of this depression? In what ways is it a helpful or unhelpful experience? In what ways is it necessary or unnecessary? What are all the things that are going on here and now in this particular context of their suffering? And in what way can I help or provide wiggle room within that domain of suffering? So let's apply it to gender. So first dimension on gender, unary thinking. Women are women and have these definable characteristics, okay? So we can start with primary sexual characteristics. Women have XX chromosomes, breast tissue, narrower waist, broader hips, etc. That these are the definable characteristics of women. So second dimension on gender, and you notice that gender and sex are being conflated here, is women are not men and have opposite definable characteristics to men. So if I change anything about the definition of women, I simultaneously change the definition of men. Okay? And by the way, we've seen this a lot in our culture. Man shall not live on coffee alone. So hydration is important. So anytime I have a definitional characteristic of woman, then the opposite characteristic is a characteristic of man. Okay? So if women are soft, men must be hard. If men are hairy, women must be hairless. If men are tall, women must be short. If women are emotional, men must be stoic. Okay, you guys get where I'm coming from? That there's this tendency amongst many people in our society to think in oppositional terms. So therefore, if women are empowered, men are disempowered, right? So if I have a special scholarship program for women, then binary thinkers will stand up and say, where's the scholarships for men? Well, I don't know. If you want to create a scholarship program for men, please do. I'm creating a scholarship program for women. Why are we having this discussion, right? So it's that oppositional thinking. So women are not men, and therefore they must be opposite. And so we see that a lot. Like, okay, we'll probably get into this more when we talk about porn. There is a very interesting development in my lifetime around the shaving of pubic hair for men and women. Right? If men are hairy, women must be hairless. And so I actually did some research on this, and I'm sorry I cannot remember the pornography actor who started this, but it was a woman in the 90s, in the early 90s, who found her career as an actress within pornography. She was getting less gigs, right? She was pushing her late 20s. She wasn't able to book as many films. She was losing money. And so she shaved off all of her pubic hair, wondering if that would make a difference. And boom, she started scoring more gigs. Then other women who were in that same age group, who were also losing money, started shaving their pubic hair as a way to get more gigs. And then after a short period of time, and we're talking like 3 years, it became the norm. Well, likewise, now we've got men with big hairy bushes of pubic hair having sex with women without pubic hair, and then the pornography producers started seeing that and going, oh, well, guys, you may not shave that back because we can't get as explicit an image of penetrative intercourse as we could otherwise. And so therefore, within 5 years, the men started going hairless. It was really interesting, right? And so now we do it as a cultural practice when it started in the pornography industry, regardless. When this woman was interviewed, the first woman who shaved off her pubic hair deliberately to get more gigs, she demonstrated binary thinking along gendered lines. That, well, the men are big and hairy. I thought the less hair I had on my body, the more feminine I would appear, right? You see how that's binary thinking. And in our culture, it worked. I haven't done this today, but at some point I'll look up how much people spend on removing hair from their bodies and the difference between engendered women and engendered men on that particular practice, right? Men are now more likely to shave all bits of their body compared to what they used to do, but women are far more likely still, and it costs a lot of money and people make a lot of money on it. So that's just one example. So the third dimension on gender. Gender is as a concept is ultimately relative and hence meaningless. That anytime I see an engendering process going on, I know that that is relative to that particular person or that particular culture in that particular moment. Like uh, a colleague of mine has the best taste in pantsuits, tie, button down, jacket, slacks, shoes on point. They are biologically XX chromosomed, right? And very much appear feminine, very female. But holy hell, do they have amazing taste in suits, right? And so if I were relativist about that, I would go, well, what she is doing is she's just playing with our cultural interest and cultural fascination around style and gender, and it's all relative. So you do you, boo, right? That's a relativist position. You look good in pantsuits, you rock it, girl. And if anybody says, there's maybe more appropriate attire you could wear, that's all bullshit because it's all relative, right? Now, to a contextualist, fourth dimensional thinker. Gender is contextual and negotiated, and gender co-constitutes and is informed by others. The way in which we have a particular engendered context in the society is contextual. When I'm out fishing with the guys, the manifestations of my gender is a little bit different than when I'm at home snuggling with my daughter with a broken heart, right? Comforting her. She's crying on daddy's chest. And so the manifestation of my gender is in the context and authentically within the context of the gendered expression. Okay. In my relationship with my sweetheart, as you know, I'm the one that writes love poems. I'm the one that writes these gushy love poems. Okay. She doesn't do that. And so therefore that is a gendered expression. But when I'm hanging out with my male colleagues, I'm not writing them love poems, right? That context is different. It's still authentically a part of my gendered identity. At the same time, though, the context that I am in calls for certain gendered performances in certain ways. And so some of us have the radical position, and I actually learned this from the person who taught my psychology of sex class years ago, a lesbian woman, et cetera, very, very interesting and dynamic colleague. And I'm very grateful that she's a part of my education, where she makes very convincing cases that gender is performative, right? Gender is not inherited. It is inheritant. It's something that we perform. And therefore we perform in certain contexts in certain ways based on who we authentically are within those contexts. And so this is one of the reasons why fourth dimensional thinking is so challenging, is because, wait, I'm still authentically me, and how I perform my gender is within certain contexts. And therefore that context is a part of my authentic performance of my gender. Isn't that relativism? No, relativism is it's random, right? It's all relative. It's all relative to perspective and point of view. Whereas a contextual thinker would say, no, the context is importantly a part of how I express my gender. Okay. And so therefore, when we're out fishing and the bro sitting next to me on the boat is just starts talking about, his latest breakup, and I can tell he's gutted, he's holding the tears back because he's performing his gender as not being overly emotional, etc. I know that for me to stand up, go over in the boat and push his face into my tender bosom and stroke his hair and say, I'm so sorry, baby, isn't an authentic performance of gender based on what that relationship is in the context of us fishing together, right? But when I'm home and it's one of my kids that's brokenhearted, they just flop on the couch and plop their heads right on dad's chest and cry, right? That is an authentic performance of gender or of engendered activities within the context of that family. So I am still the same person. The fact that my buddy on the boat is crying means a lot to me, and there are ways I express sympathy and compassion. Oh man, I'm so sorry, Bo. That sucks, bro. You know what I mean? Things like that. But I'm not going to snuggle him into my tender bosom. Okay. So for some of you, this may be a hard concept to wrap your heads around, but I'm hoping by the end of the class you'll have a better sense of it. Some of you are like, I totally get it. Great. The trick is endeavoring to practice fourth dimensional thinking around issues that our culture is either very quick to snap into a binary, either or, black and white, right, or to just relativize away. So it's hard to continue to think fourth dimensionally in a world that's demanding that we think second dimensionally or third dimensionally. So when our our application to sexuality. So, first dimension on sexuality. Straight has these following definable characteristics. So, that's first dimension, right? Here is sex, and sex is, and so you see this in the literature up until, about 1930, right? It was just assumed that sex was heterosexual sex. The heteronormative, that's just the way it was, and there was no questioning it. This is what sex is: penis, vagina, sex, right? There was no intimation or looking at sex otherwise. Now, that's not to say a lot of other sexual activities between and within sexes was happening. It was, but the cultural assumption was this, right? Sex is just this thing. And so, second dimension on sexuality, this actually arises for the first time in the late 19th century when heterosexuality was actually invented. And heterosexuality was invented after homosexuality was invented. And we'll talk about this later in the course. But some psychiatrists invented homosexuality, which they defined as the morbid preoccupation of having sex with people of the same sex. So having sexual encounters and sexual experiences with people of the same sex. Then after that, they went, wait a minute, because they're binary thinkers. They go, oh, so heterosexuality is morbid preoccupation with having sex with members of the opposite sex, right? That there's now an invention of an opposite sex, not a different sex, but an opposite sex. And you notice that morbid preoccupation was the psychiatric theme, meaning sacrificing of my own health and welfare and well-being in order to have sex with, in the case of the original definition of homosexuality, members of my same sex, and the original definition of heterosexuality that came out right after, of the so-called opposite sex. Okay, morbid preoccupation, meaning I'm destroying my health to do this. And I love that because today the definition has changed. And so they lost around 1940. Morbid preoccupation fades from the psychiatric literature. And if it's you like having sex with people of the same sex, you're gay or homosexual. If you like having sex with people of the so-called opposite sex, then you are heterosexual, right? But they lost the word premorbid. Sorry, not premorbid, morbid preoccupation, rather. So, second dimension on sexuality. Straight has an opposite that we call gay, and they have mutually opposite characteristics. If gay men are effeminate and have great taste in shoes, etc., well, then straight men must be very masculine and be clueless when it comes to fashion, right? And so if gay people are open and honest with their feelings, then straight people must be emotionally closed off with their feelings. Do you get how those stereotypes play out in our culture? Yes, we both know those stereotypes are grossly inaccurate. But do you see how those stereotypes play out in our culture? Okay. And so the third dimension on sexuality is radically relative within and across individuals. It's you do you, boo. If you call yourself straight today and gay tomorrow and bisexual on Friday, great. You do you, boo, right? There's no definable characteristics that are just relativized away. Yes, you're getting in the way of my students' learning. Okay, so the fourth dimension on sexuality is that sexuality demonstrates certain cultural and contextual consistencies and inconsistencies at the same time, indicating a change in meaning and within a change in context. So, one of my friends is dear friends, and we'll talk about her several times in this class, with her permission. She is a transgendered woman, and it's really fun because, like, this has been about 5 years ago. we were out shopping for dresses. So my wife was shopping for dresses, and my trans friend was shopping for dresses. My trans friend Kate was shopping for dresses. And they are very much speaking very feminine tones, etc. And they were having a hard time getting some help from the staff in this particular store. And it was really fun watching Kate drop her voice into a masculine register from, this dress looks really lovely. The lace pattern look, I love the lace pattern and how it matches with my jacket. And then she's trying to ask the proprietress if this particular blouse comes in a certain size, and the proprietress was kind of blowing her off. And so it was really fun watching Kate go, excuse me, I need help here. Like her voice dropped into a very masculine bass register, and it startled the hell out of the woman behind the counter. And so I know that's a gendered performance, but it also relates to sexuality, that there are certain cultural consistencies and inconsistencies at the same time. Like, I don't have time to tell the story because we just ran out of time. So we will go back through first through fourth dimensional thinking, unary, binary, trinary, and quaternary, categorical, oppositional, relativistic, and contextual in our next meeting. And so we'll apply that again. We'll review gender and sex, and then we'll go on and talk about the importance of fourth dimensional thinking in general, especially those of us who are in the field of psychology, social work, NFT, etc. So thank you guys. I will see you next time.